Welcome to Pub and Porch, Applied Stoicism in Modern Life, hosted by Adam Piercy and Mick Mulroy. Welcome back to Pub and Porch, Applied Stoicism. I'm your host, Adam Piercy, with my co-host, Mick Mulroy here. So today, we want to continue on the series where we talk about prominent Stoics of history. And we're going to spend today talking about a man who needs some introduction because he's prominent in the world of sort of Stoic history, but he's not as well known as the big three. The big three being Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius. But it's an interesting story about this man because he actually taught one of the big three. He taught Epictetus, and that man that we're going to talk about today is Musonius Rufus. So, Mick, you had wanted to talk to him a little bit as well. You and I have both been reading Chuck Chakrapanny's book series on Musonius. So, what's your first entry into the world of Musonius Rufus today?
So I think he's called the Roman Socrates, right? And it might be for the reasons you just laid out. Although Socrates is obviously hugely well known, but Socrates being the teacher of Plato, Plato being the teacher of Aristotle, Aristotle being the teacher of Alexander the Great. So there's like a direct lineage. And Zeno pops in there for, as he did go to Plato's Academy.
Yeah.
But in this case, Musonius Rufus, as you already mentioned, was a teacher of Epictetus. Epictetus had several students, many of whom went on to teach Aurelius, if I remember my history as it was taught to me. And so he has a hugely important role in the advancement of not just Stoic philosophy, but Western philosophy, right? Which is, with Stoicism being a component of it. Why do I like him so much? And I really do. We had that one episode on Stoic as the street philosophy.
Yeah.
I think he really does. I mean, so did Zeno, of course, but really epitomizes that. He was all about making the philosophy a practical life guidance, not just, academics talking about this from a kind of sanitized perspective, not actual practitioners, but viewing it just simply as a study in ancient thought, right? He had many rules on all sorts of levels, right? He talked about cut your hair, eat clean and healthy. He talked about what a marriage should be in a very and very advanced. And by the way, I was just reading this because my son is getting married here shortly. So I was, of course, looking for smart Stoic wisdom on happy marriage. Yeah. And if you haven't done it, I suggest reading Rufus's description of what a marriage should be, because it would rival a modern, I think, interpretation of a marriage. In fact, maybe even more advanced. Anyway, it's phenomenal. He also, I think, is largely responsible for the movement inside Stoicism on physical fitness, mental endurance, challenging yourself to endure less than comfortable environs. That's all in Musonius Rufus. I mean, literally, they might have taken parts of his philosophy on that subject and made what is the modern special operations view of military training. I mean, to be frank.
Right.
He was a vegetarian, we believe, although it's not quite clear. But he was very specific on eating simply, eating healthily, eating as close to natural as now. There's a whole industry that says the same thing, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's so much to him that I think really sets the standard for what a Stoic should want to live like. And
right.
for if you're looking for actual details, because a lot of people like that. They don't just like, be a good person. Okay, that's good. But this not that you have to follow everything, right? This isn't a religion. It's not a dogmatic scenario. But he does lay out, like, and it's kind of what you would want a Stoic to be: humble, not flashy, dresses, for purpose, not pizzazz, is super healthy, physically fit, all these things that you kind of think of a Stoic. And not that he was the only one that came up with this, but it's very detailed. And how you treat other people, including your spouse, and the cornerstone of the society is marriage and a family. And I mean, it's a lot of really, and then I'll throw it back to you, because I'm sure you have a lot to say on this. But he also walked the walk, right?
Yeah.
He challenged corruption at a time when the people who were being corrupt could crush him.
Yeah.
He accepted exile over complacency willfully. He was part of the Stoic opposition. He was exiled several times. I really want to go to that island that he started a colony of philosophers on.
Yeah.
I really do, because I love that stuff. But, he walked the walk, is what I'm saying. It wasn't, again, street philosophy, actually had really sound everyday advice, and he showed that his thoughts are willing to fight for. And in his case, willing to really endure a lot of ostracism, being ostracized, and exile.
Yeah.
Especially during the time of Nero.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, he has some parallels in his life with other prominent philosophers of that period. I mean, it's funny when you think about it, because it's, in the period that we generally study, the real apex of Stoicism in history, it's that thing where you're kind of like, these philosophers are facing off with emperors essentially, right? And nowadays, I don't know if that, I don't know if we would see that again. It's just not the same. At least there's not a prominence of, having that kind of debate right now. So the thing that I take away from Musonius when I read him, it's interesting, because when you look at the big three that everyone talks about, right, that I opened with, so we're talking Marcus, Seneca, and Epictetus, right? Usually people talk about them being on a spectrum, where Epictetus is on the hard lines end of the spectrum, and
Mm-hmm.
then Seneca is on the sort of much looser end of the spectrum, and then Marcus is right in the middle. And Musonius it's interesting to me, because I think Musonius falls in between Marcus and Nero, or excuse me, Marcus and Seneca. And I find that interesting for two reasons. One, because there's just such a practical applicability of what he talks about. But two, because being the tutor of Epictetus, right? It's interesting how hardline Epictetus goes in his discourses, where he's quite strict. Is all I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying. Honestly, I think it's a relative range, right? It's ultimately, Stoics are quite understanding, I think, in their philosophy. So that's the first takeaway I take away from Musonius, is where does he fit within that spectrum, right? Like if you have a graph, right, and it's like strict versus, I guess sticking to strict versus real life, or whatever I would say. It's so interesting to find where they fall when you look at that 50-50 line all the way up. So that's my first takeaway from Musonius, right? And you were kind of talking about that. I mean, he has lectures on hairstyles, which it sounds odd, but in the Roman world, it was such a visual practice to kind of, you were showing yourself off. It's
Mm-hmm.
when you know how personal appearance made people, like, it sets your status, it sets how you're treated, right? Even the color you wear, whether you're wearing a
Mm-hmm.
veil or not, right? If you're a woman,
Mm-hmm.
for example, once you understand the context of it, you start to go, oh, like, this is really practical, this is like an everyday thing for them, right? Which is I think where it falls in there. Now, the thing that I really like about Musonius, for sure, though, is that he's also incredibly progressive, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, he's teaching Epictetus, who's a former slave, so it shows that he sort of teaches anybody. But he also agrees with he's basically an early feminist, we would call them now. There are other
Okay.
feminists in history, even going far back. I would say even Socrates probably was a feminist
Tino.
to some degree, but Musonius absolutely is one. He's definitely got lectures dealing with women, right? He arguing that they are equal in a marriage,
Yep.
for example, and you were talking about that too. But I think calling him a feminist is really not wrong. It's just a modern word for kind of how he was. And there's a real social progressivism to him that I really think is it's kind of interesting, right? Because if you change some of the language of his translations, it wouldn't really feel that out of place today, depending on what kind of social
Exactly.
activism discussions you were having, right?
Yep.
And I think to me that's a big one where you kind of think, okay, so because minimalism and whatnot, that is a little bit wider around, right? Like Musonius was sort of taken from the Cynics, and then there's also like Eastern Asian traditions that are very minimalist as well. But um, and I don't want to take away from that. I just mean like his feminism is something that is really not seen that much, and I think to me that's a big one that sticks out. And I'm frankly I'm very proud that that's part of the core roots of our philosophical traditions, at least. So.
Yeah. Gender rights.
And then
Absolutely.
I think as well, what's interesting to me is just that it very much like Epictetus, he sort of has a handbook of like 12 quick lessons, right? But he also has these lectures that have survived. He's one of the ones whose lectures have survived. I think like him and Epictetus, the lectures have survived. Now Epictetus's lectures weren't written by Epictetus; they were, I think, notes from Arian, right? So
Yeah.
Musonius is almost
Well,
a
his students
first
were the ones that
wonderful.
recorded his too. I think it was
Say
Lucius
again.
that. I think Musonius Rufus's student Lucius was the
Oh, they're
primary.
recorded by Lucius as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I think
but it
that's.
is one of the primary accounts, right? Like
Yeah.
from lectures. Again, it makes him different from Marcus, where Marcus is not lecturing. Marcus is sort of conversing with himself, right? So, anyways, those are my initial takeaways I take from Musonius Rufus. I'm sure, it's always difficult to kind of equate someone from that period to today, but Musonius, he does it pretty well, frankly. He does it pretty well. And you don't get the sense that you kind of have to, like, with some things certain people say about slaves, right? When it comes to Roman philosophers of any kind or Greek philosophers, you do kind of have to look at that through the lens of history and know the context for that. Musonius doesn't really, he seems to be a little bit easier on that kind of part of history. So,
So on
so,
the
oh, yeah, go ahead.
issue of the woman's rights, I mean, it is actually a pretty consistent part of Stoic philosophy,
Yes.
right? If you
Yes.
look at Zeno's Republic, which was, I mean, I think Musonius Rufus was born around 30 AD, if I'm correct. And then Zeno's Republic would have been 300 BC, right? So, so
Yeah.
300 years plus before Musonius, you had Zeno saying essentially the same thing.
Yeah.
In fact, specifically saying women should be allowed to be completely educated just like men. And I
Yes.
know today it's like, well, no kidding, man. I mean, it's like, well, no, this was 2,300 years ago. And there's plenty of places, I would imagine, majority of places in the world, women aren't equal now, right? So, it's important to highlight one because it's an important issue, of course, but it's also somewhat not contrary, but not exactly what you think of when you think of Stoics. Like you usually think of men for whatever reason, and you think of like soldiers and businessmen and athletes, and maybe scientists, but there's not that many women, and we of
Right.
course need to change that. We need to broaden it, and there's ample reason. Like we're the original, I think, philosophy that actually pushed for equality across the genders,
Yeah.
well before other philosophies and religions, which still haven't entirely embraced it everywhere. But I think that is an important point. But if you really want to have, and people do look for this, and there's all sorts of modern movements. When I was doing research for this, a lot of people use elements of Rufus's lectures to promote certain parts of a lifestyle. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Eating healthy, for example. It's a
Yeah.
lot easier way back then because they didn't have industrial food,
Sure.
but and then we've all like we talk about a lot, taking the extreme view of not extreme, but physical fitness. And by the way, if you didn't see the Corcadona 250, I think that's how you pronounce it. To wrap this together, a woman won the 256-mile race across Arizona against everybody.
Yes, I heard about this.
Everybody. And her name, I've seen it. I looked it up. It's actually Scottish. What is her name? I feel like we should. I will
Strong
find it.
Celtic name. That's who wins.
250 winner. Sorry, but I think for somebody who wins a 250,
256
her
miles.
name was Rachel Entrican. Rachel
Okay.
Entrican. Her name deserves to be mentioned on the Stoic,
Absolutely.
in the Stoic world, because he talks about, he being Rufus talks about, pushing yourself, endurance, being tough, quite
Yeah.
frankly. And
Yeah.
she was everything. She was all of that. I mean, she's run by a pretty big margin. And it's, anyway, so that
Yeah.
she's a good example of both the idea of equality and the idea of pushing oneself in an endurance sport that is, I mean, I've done, I think, 6 ultras, nothing that even close to that far. And it is psychological as much as it is anything. Yes, it's
Yeah.
physical, right? Your body just starts
Yeah.
falling apart. And I've only gone up to like 50 milers. Um, I don't even know how one would do that times 5, to be frank. But
Yeah.
it's the mental ability to push yourself so far beyond where your body's telling you you shouldn't be, that is just completely uh, inspiring to me. So, I mean, good on her.
Totally.
Yeah. So I think that is something that we're seeing a lot of modern Stoics talk about, and the people who want to follow the philosophy. If you really want, some guiding principles in your life that are super healthy, I think everybody would agree. The 21 lectures of Musonius Rufus can set you on your way for sure.
Totally. So I think one of the big things with Musonius Rufus, and this is something, and Ryan Holiday's talked about this a little bit, right? About how it's a core part of philosophy to be socially active, right? For social activism to be a key part of your life. And
Yeah.
this is something that's not uncommon to Musonius Rufus, but he specifically talks about it, right? And something I find for him is that he ends up going through 2 exiles, right? He gets exiled under I can't I think it's he gets
Nero.
exiled under Nero twice. Actually, that's what it is. He gets exiled under Nero twice, excuse me. And this is something that it's common for philosophers throughout that era. They get expelled. I mean, Hadrian expels all
Mm-hmm.
the philosophers, right? For
Yep.
example, and then they come back slowly, and Marcus gets to encounter them again. But I think Rufus, I think, has a really good way of doing the social activism side, where he's sort of like, doing good is not disobedience; it's still obedience, even if you're countermanding something like that your parents tell you, or that, like, leaders tell you. Like, if you're doing the right thing, if you know that, you have to stand up and do that. And again, these are repeated topics within Stoicism, but I think it's important for everyone to understand just how core something like that is to the philosophy. Like, if you're a a cynic or something like that, it just doesn't have within the philosophy this idea that you're gonna kind of be like that. It's cynics, in fact, in many ways, sort of extricate themselves from that. Or if you have sophists, right, they sort of believe in just doing what you can to win an argument rather than doing what you can to make
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
social improvements for yourself
That's
and
right.
others. But it's so core to Stoicism. And Musonius has lectures that are titled things like oh, I had it here and I lost it, sorry. You have people, well, even the women and men are equal lecture, or the women should receive the same education as men lectures. That's social activism, and he is outwardly standing up and talking about those things, right? And again, it's one of those very prominent parts of the philosophy. But Musonius is one of the ones who does it, and he's doing this before, like, he's teaching Epictetus this, right? And this is
Yep.
before Marcus Aurelius. And we know Marcus Aurelius has exposure to Musonius's writings and Epictetus' writings because he talks about it. Like, we know he sort of references, he's making a quote in one of his journal entries about something from an Epictetus journal that now no longer, we don't have any of those fragments, like, it doesn't exist
Mm-hmm.
anymore. So the thing
Mm-hmm.
is like, this is carrying forward. And I think this is, if you were to contrast Musonius with Seneca, right, they're existing at the same time.
Yep.
Seneca takes a different approach. He sort of some people call him a collaborator. I don't know if I would say that, but Seneca is in this interesting position where he's tutoring the emperor, but he's also the richest man in Rome. And he's, I think there's this weird balance he's trying to strike. And I think I'm with most people now where I'm like, I'm not sure he strikes that balance really well. But at the same time, like, he is at least a Stoic, and he is trying to, do the right thing to some degree. I think you and I have talked about this before. Like, if Seneca's with Nero and all that, and we know how good Seneca is, how bad would Nero have been had Seneca not been around at all, right? It's like,
Yeah,
it probably would have been a lot worse.
that's a
But the
good
social
point.
activism is a big thing. I mean, to go through 2 exiles and a third return, that's a pretty significant thing. Like, Seneca didn't make it through, like, you know eventually he gets sentenced to death by his student Nero, right? And I think, Musonius somehow gets out of that one, and that's what happens. But that's a key thing for me for sure. It's because it's one of the ones where he prominently says that, like, Marcus social activism is more like, do the right thing, if it's not right, don't do it. But Musonius is sitting there going, no, 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 step in, do these things, right, make that happen.
Yep, step in and speak up. I mean, I don't know another philosophy where that's really a core element. Am I missing one? Where it's not just do the right thing, focus on yourself, on being a good person, and you can
Right.
find all your happiness within your own grasp. I mean, there's elements to that, but it's Stoicism doesn't stop there at all. I mean, it's always been. I mean, the Stoic opposition. I mean, think about it that way,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's to not only are you supposed to do the right thing, but you're supposed to inspire others to do the right thing, and you're supposed to call out people that are essentially the opposite.
Yeah.
People that oppress other people, people that are corrupt, people that are dishonest. Um, it's a clear part of how I view Stoicism, not an obnoxious point of view, or um, using violence or what have you, but certainly like a sit-in, for example. If you think about segregated restaurants in the South, and a sit-in was you sit in there and you make
Yeah.
sure that uh, you know African Americans at the time could sit in a diner too, and you're willing to
Yeah.
sit next to them, and you know and take the consequences. So that would be an activist the kind of that I'm talking about, and the kind that I think Stoicism really promotes. And one more point on that, I think obviously, if you're advocating for things that directly impact you, right? So like you're a woman and you're advocating for women to be included in everything. That's great. That's great. But I think what really sets the standard is when you're advocating for somebody else's rights,
Yeah.
right? So if, until that happens, I mean, most people advocate for their own rights, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when you're not of the group and you're advocating for it, I think that's the highest form of social activism to be
Yeah. I think,
offering.
there's that saying, which I can't remember if it's Greek or Japanese. I don't remember what it is, but it's like, you can tell a lot by a civilization when they plant trees that they won't be able to enjoy, right? Or,
Yes.
by an age or a group. And I think that's one of those things that definitely is so prevalent in Stoicism. I think it's important here, talking about social activism as well, to discuss the context that relates with today, right? In the time period in which you have Socrates through until, well, essentially Marcus, right? There is extreme levels of upheaval in the world in which they're living in, right? And it's I don't think it's a coincidence that the birth of democracy in Athens meets with Socrates and the birth of other philosophies, and then that time period leading around 300 when Zeno's coming up, right? That's a follow on from Plato. That's like, because Zeno's got that counter to the Plato's Republic, right? But that's also another great time of upheaval. Rome is expanding. They're still a republic, right? They're expanding on their peninsula. And then when you get to like the start of the end of the republic, I should say, right? There are prominent Stoics coming forward again, right? You have your Cato's. Brutus was a Stoic, right? He was, I think he was Cato's son-in-law, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then you have Cicero, who a lot of people would say he's more of a peripatetic. He's not a Stoic. He's sort of a mixture, or he's at
But
least
he
an
writes a
eclectic,
lot
which
about Stoics. Yeah, you learn a lot
yeah,
from reading Cicero.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And then you have, but then so then as the Republic sort of falls apart, and you end up with the first emperor, right, and you get the first of the empire, then you also have these prominent Stoics stepping forward because, and I think it's just that thing of it's this whole upheaval circumstance happening right now, and people are looking for something for guidance, right? And people like Musonius come about because when you are surrounded by the roiling waters of politics, well, you're in a place where it's the first real constitution, right? It's the first real um, you know, elected, like sort of executive and legislative body system being put forward in a place for the first time. I think it's very important to keep in mind that it didn't have to be that Stoics came up at that time. I think people were looking for something. And then if you relate to that today, this is why I think, you and I are both recommending Musonius to people for sure. I mean, he's an original. Is that today, with the political upheaval we've seen, especially in the 20th century, in the latter part of the 20th, and then now the 21st century, I think people are looking for that guidance, right? And it comes from things like philosophy, a bit of a rule book, as it were, a handbook, if you were to use the Enchiridion example from Epictetus. And so I think Musonius comes out at a time that's very much filled with upheaval politically and socially, right? Rome's going through a huge social upheaval, right? Christianity is around. So it's not just politics. There's this whole, spiritual heart of Rome kind of being pulled in multiple directions type of thing. And Stoics are there. And I think, that's in my opinion, that's why people like Musonius resonate so heavily today, because of this upheaval that we're seeing, again, in politics across the globe. I'm not talking about anywhere specifically. Everybody seems to have something to debate today. So,
Yes, right. And always remember the Stoic notion that you don't have to have an opinion on everything. I tell myself that
of
a lot.
course.
Um, Another thing that I would bring up for Rufus is that he inspired so many people in the future on his ability to accept uh, his trial with humility and really just focusing on what he could do with the situation. Whether it's Viktor Frankl, who
Yeah.
created a whole psychology, logos, in large part says he endured the concentration camps of the Nazis um, by his understanding of Epictetus and his teacher Musonius Rufus. Right, so it is that in that I think it was Frankel who, and I'll paraphrase because I don't have it in front of me, but if you have uh, the why, you can withstand the how. Um, Meaning, and I think I screwed that quote up, but ultimately is talking about, if you have a purpose in life, you can endure a lot of shit, right?
Yeah.
And Frankel's a great example of that. But also, if you look at um, Nelson Mandela, when he would read Epictetus in the Robbins prison in South Africa. I mean, this is these two, and one was a student of the other, has inspired people through history that's endured horrible things. Stockdale, was a POW. I mean, he said, I'm entering the world of Epictetus. I mean, if you go down the list, um, it's not just the lofty social activism, which I think is incredibly important, but it's also the ability to realize that at the end of the day, you have control of your own dignity, and how you react to things are
Yeah.
yours. How things react to you, things that happen to you, in many cases are not up to you. And that's I think he's one of the main figures, along with Epictetus, of course, that really inspired people throughout history, even till today.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, the reason why these things resonate so much is because of their universality, right? In so many of these cases. So I think it's best for us to wrap up there, but we should close the primary part of our talk by mentioning that a lot of what Mick and I are citing today is from a book called Stoic Lessons, Musonius Rufus' Complete Works. This is part of this series called Stoicism in Plain English by Dr. Chuck Chakrapani, friend of the podcast. Know Chuck well. So he actually lives here in Ontario where I live. So definitely check that out. Easy to find. And, I think we would both recommend that. But for today, I think we're going to wrap up there, but we would love to hear from the audience as to, if maybe you're experiencing Musonius for the first time, or he's been a longtime friend of yours as you've read him over the years. We'd love to hear from you and your opinions. So info@pubandporch.com, or give us a comment on the video on YouTube when this comes out. And we'd love to hear from you, because he's an interesting one. I sort of think of him as the fourth, right? He's not the big three. He's the other one. He's the other Beatle, as it were. So, all right, Mick. Well, thanks for today's chat. We will talk to you on the next one. Cheers.
Sláinte. Thank you for listening to the Pub and Porch podcast. If you'd like to find out more about the podcast or its host, head over to pubandporch.com, and you can listen to all our episodes on Spotify, Apple, or whichever platform you prefer. And if you'd like to help out with the podcast, you can find us on Patreon. Drop us an email if you have a comment on any past episode, you have a suggestion for future episodes, or you have an essay on an important topic for Stoicism. Send it to us, and then we can be reached at info@pubandporch.com. Today's music was provided by bensound.com. Until next time, Pub and Porch out.